Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Eye on Africa. My name is Awasar. I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at Michigan Studies Center's African Studies Center. Eye on Africa is our weekly seminary series. I'm very delighted today to welcome Eric Kesse as our guest speaker. A brief introduction. Eric is a final year doctoral candidate in African history at Michigan State University. His research broadly centers on 18th and 19th century African environmental history with special attention to Africa's water systems and bodies of water. He is interested in how African groups have forged complex relationships with bodies of water over time and how those relationships have shaped the history of the continent. To this end, his dissertation investigated the social and environmental history of the Nulezo, a stillhouse community located in the middle of the Amanzule River in southwestern Ghana. In recognition of his past and ongoing scholarly works, Eric has received several awards and fellowships from reputable national and international funding organizations, including the U.S. Department of Education, the Otumfulo Educational Program, as well as Michigan State University's Research and Dissertation Completion Fellowship. Welcome, Eric, and I pass it on to you now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah. Thank you, everyone, for joining in today. I'm talking about an aspect of Gold Coast history that has been quite overlooked for some time, and I'm concentrating on a territory called Apollonia. My research, actually, as Dr. Sarah said, centers on this village called Nzulezo. It's a stilt house village, far removed from land and well situated in the middle of a big river called the Amanzule River in southwestern Ghana. And this community is located in the Apollonian region, the region that I'm going to be talking about today. Sadly, I'm not talking about this village, but Apollonia also has a very fascinating history and sort of a phenomenal historical lessons to tell us. I am of the view that our audience is diverse. So I would want to begin off by locating where Ghana is on the African map. That's the place highlighted in red in the western side. And when you go to Ghana or get into Ghana, there's a map of Ghana right here. On the coast, on the far western side, southwestern side. So this is where Nzulezo is located. And the Apollonian territory is around here. So it's sort of a border town between Ghana and present-day Ghana and Ivory Coast, right? This is, I want you to pay attention to this curve, this point here. It's the Cape 3 point, and it's going to feature a lot in some of the maps that I'll be showing, and I'll be making reference to it as a landmark. So let's kindly pay attention to it. This is an 18th century map of the coast of West Africa. And this is the curve, the Cape 3 point that I made reference to. And this is the map of Apollonia. So essentially, Ivory Coast begins from here, but Apollonia is this one. It is a well-watered territory. It has a lot of bodies of water. On its western side is the Tano River, and the eastern side is the Ankobra. And by the way, these two rivers are part of the large rivers in Ghana. And the southern part here is bordered or covered by the Atlantic Ocean. So you realize that the territory is covered or bordered by big, large bodies of water. This is another map of or a sketch of Apollonia. This was produced in 1684, so 17th century sketch. And this is a view from the sea. It's described that Apollonia has some hills, right? And you see pockets of villages here and here, right? And today, what I am going to do is I'm going to identify Apollonia's historical place or position in Gold Coast slave trade historiography. In other words, when we are to examine the geography of slave trading on the Gold Coast, where did Apollonia lie within it, right? And I will make an argument that Apollonia was most likely the only region in pre-colonial Ghana or Gold Coast where the Atlantic slave trade did not flourish. And this makes Apollonia an outlier in the slave trade economy on the Gold Coast. I will also be discussing some reasons why you should actually pay attention to this study, because it offers some great significance. Permit me to read most of my presentation, because I have a lot of information to give, and if I do not read, I may not be able to cover them all. Yeah, Apollonia's history, early history, is mainly conveyed through oral traditions, which explain that the ancestors of Apollonia might have originated from the Sahel region of West Africa, perhaps from the ancient Mali Empire. The traditions do not offer a precise historical time that marks the beginning of the Apollonian society. However, Portuguese sources trace Apollonia's history to the late 1400s and or early 1500s. The Portuguese came to the Gold Coast in 1471, and their records suggest that they encountered a group of people who inhabited the Apollonian region. So based on this fact, it is safe to assume that the people of Apollonia might have settled in their present geographical location well before the arrival of the Europeans. Well, a tradition also relates that the Apollonian people first identified themselves as Nzima people. They were called Nzima people. So if you're in Ghana and you're watching us, we are talking about the Nzima community. But this Nzima identity may have been derived from the people's encounters with neighboring Seshi and Anyi societies. On the other hand, the Apollonian identity emerged from the people's interactions with the Portuguese. It is believed that it was the Portuguese who named this region Appolonia. It is explained that the Portuguese arrived in this region on a day that commemorated the festival of their Apollo deity. So as a memento, they chose to name this region and its people Apollonia. Some scholars like Pierluigi Valsecchi find this explanation quite unconvincing. According to Valsecchi, he believes that the Apollonian identity probably derives from a type of settlement called Apollonias, which was pervasive in the region. This settlement was characterized by large houses situated under polon trees. In the Nzima local language, the polon tree was called Elunlikpole. So it is believed that the name Apollonia was associated with Elunlikpole, or the Apollonias settlement. And for the purpose of this presentation, I will use the Apollonian identity instead of the Nzima identity, sort of to present a better historical picture of my analysis. And again, I would like to remind you, my goal is to identify Apollonia's historical place, and I'm arguing that it was an outlier in the Gold Coast slave trade historiography. Now, in his review of one of the seminal historical monographs on Apollonia, historian David Heneage calls Apollonia certainly less important historically, if not necessarily less interesting than the Fanti area along the Gold Coast. Heneage's assertion is problematic. To describe Apollonia as historically less important raises critical questions about the perspective from which Heneage approaches Apollonia's history and the sources he draws on to make such a bold claim. It appears that Heneage did not take the time to examine Apollonia's oral histories and several other historical sources that reveal a rich Apollonian past. In this presentation, I examined some oral history data on Apollonia's historical position and role in slave trading on the Gold Coast during the 18th and early 19th century. The oral histories, together with European archival sources and statistical data on slave exportations in Apollonia, reveal that on the Gold Coast, Apollonia was the only kingdom that did not trade many enslaved people because of two significant reasons. First, certain conditions like the prevalence of violence, the existence of European settlement and fortresses that enabled the growth of the Atlantic slave trade in several Gold Coast port towns did little to enhance the slave trade in Apollonia. And these conditions did not thrive mainly because of the interventions that Apollonian leaders put in place. And this leads me to my second point, which is specific political and socio-cultural measures that 18th and early 19th century Apollonian rulers implemented significantly diminished the intensity of the slave trade within the kingdom. The political measure consisted of Apollonian rulers' ability to implement policies that discouraged the creation of European settlements within the kingdom. It also comprised the ruler's inability to successfully implement territorial expansion programs that could have produced lots of slaves for sale. I'm sorry, someone is raising their hand. Okay, so these political measures contributed to the minimal slave trading and slave exploitation in the Gold Coast, or in the kingdom, sorry. Now, there also existed in Apollonia a powerful ritual or covenant called Amonle, which defined and maintained the relationships between Apollonian kings and new migrants who settled within the kingdom. The Amonle covenant prevented Apollonian leaders from selling their subjects of new migrants into slavery. This condition helped to reduce slave trading and exports in the region, making Apollonia an outlier in the Gold Coast slave trade geography. Evidence of the above claim reflects in the oral traditions and life histories of individuals in the kingdom. However, before analyzing some of these oral history data, it is essential to understand the indigenous systems of social servitude that existed in pre-colonial Gold Coast and how that shaped slave trading in Apollonia. So here I want to talk briefly about indigenous slavery and social servitude on the Gold Coast. Slave trade historians like Akosua Pebi have established that slavery did exist on the Gold Coast well before the coming of Europeans to the region in the late 15th century. Pebi describes that in pre-colonial Ghana, a slave was a person who had been bought in cash or in kind or acquired through various means by an individual or a group of people. She further explains that slaves were in a state of servitude guarded by rights. Now, Pebi's definitions reveal some complexities associated with the concepts of slavery and social servitude on the Gold Coast. Sorry about that. On the Gold Coast, the term servant covered a spectrum of modes of subjection. It also was a generic epithet that described one's subordinate social position to another who occupied a superordinate station. For instance, the term was used to describe a relationship between two chiefs, one superior and the other subordinate. The superior chief would refer to the subordinate one as a servant. Slaves, on the other hand, were individuals acquired through either trade, gift giving, or other means, and their social identity positioned them at the lowest echelon of society's class structures. Now, the account naming system helps to reveal some distinctions between slaves and servants on the Gold Coast. Now, among the account of Southern Ghana, different names existed for varied categories of servitude. There was the Akwa, which meant a servant, as in a maid servant or a bond servant. There also existed Donko, which translated to slave. Domum represented war captives. Awawa meant pawn, and Atre corresponded to a criminal under punishment. In practical terms, a household could have a maid servant and an Akwa at the same time who may perform similar or the same functions, but their social identities differentiated them and placed them in different statuses within their society. The same applied to the Awawa and other forms of servitude. Now, because these classifications were fluid, it was not uncommon for one to move from one category to another. In Apollonia, there is evidence of the existence of indigenous slavery and servitude. Martha Liba and Pierluigi Valsicchi explained that in the court of the king of Apollonia, there existed several divisions, among which the Jase was most popular. The Jase, headed by the Jasehine, was the royal household division that supervised the day-to-day running of the palace. Perby notes that usually the Jasehine was a slave, either an Akwa or a Donko. Under the Jasehine were various subgroups, such as the stool carriers group, drummers group, horn blowers group, and umbrella bearers group, whose leaders were themselves slaves. Members of these subgroups performed varying roles, including farming, hunting, and fishing. They also conducted trade, both interstate and long distance trade on behalf of the king or their respective masters. The emergence of the Atlantic slave trade on the Gold Coast sometime in the latter half of the 16th century brought significant transformations to the indigenous system of slavery and servitude on the Gold Coast. One such change was that the different classification of social servitude became lumped up into one, which was the Odonko, what we would call the chattel slavery. People became economically greedy and more inclined to sell off their akwa or awawa, or that is a servant or a pawn, as slave, as in the Odonko type, into the Atlantic slave market. This development led to the increase in slave trading and exportation on the Gold Coast, especially from the second half of the 17th century to the first 3 decades of the 19th century. And now I would like to establish or sort of locate Apollonia's position in this sort of slave trade debates at this point. Now, research done in recent years shows that wherever the transatlantic slave trade increased along the West African coast or coastline, it initially took its victims from coastal and near coastal communities. Over a few decades, however, victims of slave exports were outsourced from the hinterland. We witnessed this event in the early 18th century Gold Coast, as several thousands of slaves from the interior were brought to the coastal towns like Anomabo, Cape Coast, and Elmina for export. These port towns quickly became important slave trading sites that attracted several groups of people, including Gold Coast Abrempong, that is the moguls or important men, long-distance traders from other parts of West Africa, and European slave traders. The rise of the slave trade and the influx of enslaved peoples in Gold Coast coastal towns have led scholars like Rebecca Shamway and Akosua Pebi to argue that from the 18th century to the first few decades of the 19th century, the entire Gold Coast coastline transformed into sites of intensive slave trading. Well, the Kingdom of Apollonia lent itself as an exception to this thesis. Throughout the 18th and early 19th century Gold Coast, Apollonia disengaged from the slave trade, although not completely, in ways that allowed it to keep slave trading activities to the minimum. Evidence of this claim reflects in how Apollonian people remember the slave trade today. And here I'm going to delve into a few discussion about oral histories on how people remember the slave trade now in Apollonia. Several informants from Apollonia that I interviewed in 2018 through 2021 offered some fascinating views on slavery and the Atlantic slave trade in Apollonia. But those views were nothing more than vague memories of the phenomenon. When asked about the subject, my informants would respond saying this: oh, slavery did exist in Apollonia, but I do not know much about it. Or slavery was everywhere in Ghana, that is pre-colonial Gold Coast, right? So slavery definitely might have existed in Apollonia. That is why we even have a fortress over here. But if you want to learn more about it, you should speak with the caretaker at the fortress. A royal from the Western Nzima Palace also explains, saying this: for slavery, we know that it was a common practice in our society. We have learned that in Apollonia, the paramount chief, that is the king, considered his sub-chiefs as Nenkoa, and Nkoa is the plural form of Akwa, which is like servants. And then he continues by saying that, but the sub-chiefs were not like that kind of slave. Here he's referring to the Odonko, the chattel type. And he continues, says, I also learned that a king had slaves. Here he makes reference to the Odonko, but I do not know much about it, about that history, sorry. And it was the testimony of the late Auntie Mary that offered some revealing detail. Mary explained that during the era of King Kakwaka, who ruled between 1832 and 1848, the practice of human sacrifice was still ongoing, and slaves were often the victims of this ritual. King Aka was notoriously known for sacrificing slaves for spiritual reasons, and the skulls of his victims were kept near the king's palace. Mary hails from Matuabo, an important political town of Apollonia, where King Aka's palace was situated. And she related that her great-grandmothers told stories of how the spirits or ghosts of those sacrificed individuals used to linger around the palace. They believed that these spirits did not find rest in the afterlife, so they made the very spaces where their mortal remains were stored their habitats. Mary's testimony is interesting and suggestive that slavery did indeed exist in Apollonia. However, it offers little historical details about the slave trade in the region. In fact, a critical examination of the above oral testimonies reveals a lot more silence than voices. While my research informants acknowledge the existence of slavery, perhaps indigenous slavery within the Apollonian kingdom, they also demonstrate faint memories of the system's nature, dynamics, and complexities. Material and non-material cultures, such as royal regalia and folk tale that exist in Apollonia, also do not offer much insight into slavery. However, elsewhere on the Gold Coast, where indigenous slavery and the Atlantic slave trade were pervasive, people have intentionally and unintentionally retained memories of the slave trade in varied ways. For instance, slave routes leading to the coastal fortresses have been purposely preserved, and material culture like slave shackles has been carefully retained. The names of European slave merchants such as Swansea and Brew have been passed on to African subjects. Surprisingly, in Apollonia, we do not witness any of these actions or memorabilia. And I'm asking myself, why do Apollonian oral histories and material and non-material cultures tell us so little about the indigenous slavery and Atlantic slave trade? Could it be, among other reasons, that the people have intentionally buried these memories or those memories? Or perhaps the slave trade and maybe slavery in general might not have been a dominant feature of the Apollonian society. Addressing these questions, I turn my attention to statistical data from the slave trade database designed by Professor David Eltis and his team of researchers. Now, I consult slave exploitations on the Gold Coast and precisely in Apollonia, and that helps to explain how slavery and the Atlantic slave trade played out in the Apollonian kingdom. And here I'm going to show this chart here, this table, sorry. And it's just a disclaimer, this table is recreated from a pool of statistical data. I have cherry-picked these sort of communities to make my point, right? And these are communities on the Gold Coast. We have Accra, Anamabo, Apollonia, certainly, Axim, Princesstown, Cape Coast, Christianborg Castle, Emina, Cromante. And I've also chosen to show places where they were not really specified, this part, right? And it's very interesting. At face value, these are numbers, but they tell a lot of history. For instance, you realize that it was not until the second half of the 17th century that the Gold Coast began exporting people from that territory to the Americas. And the numbers were really few, like 200s, 300s. But as time progressed, you realize that the numbers increased into the thousands and 10,000s, hundreds of thousands. And then from the first half of the 19th century, it began to decline. Now, scholars who actually developed this database argue that places where we have a lot of slave exports taking place turned out to be places where slave trading was intense or very predominant, right? And from this chart, you could realize that Anamabo is recording a lot of slave exports here. For instance, in the 1750s, or 1700 to 1750s, Anomabo recorded 45,127. The second half of that century, which is 1750 to 1800, Anomabo is recording 123,221. Yet, in the whole of those centuries, as in from 1500s to 1900, Apollonia recorded only 352 export numbers. And I could not just overlook this. It's so remarkable. And I'm like, what is this telling us? But before I get into that, let me just show this map here. This is a map of the Gold Coast. And again, this is the curved part, the Cape 3 points. And this map shows towns where Europeans settled, their forts and castles. But permit me to sort of stop sharing and then reshare again, so that I could be able to, or maybe I'm still sharing. Let me try to maximize this so that we can see this quite well. Or before I maximize here, Apollonia is here. And this is an extension of this part. So you can envision or sort of imagine this as an extension of this area, right? And I can maximize right now. Now this is Axim right here, and Apollonia is right here. And in real life, Apollonia is about 1 hour. When you are from Western Apollonia, that is going to Axim, it's about an hour's drive. So it's not too far from Axim. And this is Takrady right here, secondly, going eastward. Then you come to Elmina, that's Cape Coast. And you have Anomabo right here, and Accra, or actually Comantin is also here. And you have Accra at the southeastern part of the Gold Coast. Now, when you check the numbers for Axim, it's over 1,000 for the entire period, and Apollonia is just 352, although they are not too far apart, right? And so I'm asking myself, what is this telling us, especially in terms of graphical representation? Apollonia's numbers are way insignificant, whereas places like Anomabo, Elmina, Cape Coast are recording high numbers. Well, going by the thesis that Professor David Eltis and his team have advanced, that, well, high slave export numbers equals active and intense slave trading, whereas slave export numbers equals minimal concentration of slave trading. Then this goes without saying that then in Apollonia, its 352 export figure suggests that slave trade was very minimal in the region. It's very interesting because I am trying to also put this conclusion in relation to what the oral histories are telling me. And I'm saying that, well, the oral histories are revealing vagueness in the way that people remember the slave trade. And I was making assumptions that, well, it could be that the people are consciously suppressing the memory, or perhaps slave trade wasn't really predominant in the society. That is why the memories are not present in their minds as of today. And so, considering that the statistical data is considering what the statistical data is showing, as in the minimal presence of slave trade in the region, and comparing that to what the people are exhibiting through their memories, I am inclined to believe that, well, because the slave trade was very minimal in this kingdom, that is why the people are not really exhibiting strong memory about the slave trade. Now, this could be debated, and we can talk about it in the Q&A. But there's one thing I want to note here, that these two sources are pointing in the same direction, that slave trading might have been indeed minimal in Apollonia, but these sources only show correlation between the slave trade and its intensity in a region. They do not discuss the cause and effect. And I am not interested in discussing the effects of the slave trade, but I think it's a good preoccupation to engage in why the slave trade happened. So in other words, I'm going to dedicate the rest of this presentation to discussing why Apollonia recorded such low slave exports, and why was slave trading so minimal in the region. I have identified 3 factors. I am saying that, well, to better understand Apollonia, and its position in the slave trade, you want to first understand what actually made it possible for slave trade to survive or to thrive on the Gold Coast. And then those sort of factors that made slave trade thrive, you apply them in Apollonia to sort of see how it played out. I'm very much aware that there are so many reasons. For instance, external demand of slaves from the New World, Brazil and elsewhere, was a huge factor. Proximity of a town to a coast, to the sea, is also very, very key. But on the Gold Coast, these three factors were very peculiar. And these are the prevalence of violence, European settlement and influence in a location, and the presence and utility of a European fortress in a specific location. So I'm going to get into these sort of analysis in a bit. So I'm going to start with the violence, right? Now, violence has been a prominent characteristic of pre-colonial African history, serving as a tool and a context for understanding micro and macro historical happenings. Violence within this context broadly represents any form of aggression, whether direct or indirect, hard or soft, applied to alter the nature and outcome of a situation. In slave trade debates, it is a well-known fact that the Atlantic slave trade thrived on the wheels of violence. It almost appears that wherever violence prevailed in the West African region during the Atlantic era, captives, recaptives, pawns, and slaves became the byproduct. On the Gold Coast, violence was visible in state formation processes. The rise of kingdoms such as the Denkyira, Akwamu, Achim, and Asante engendered intense political conflicts in the region, leading to the production of lots of slaves for both domestic use and the Atlantic market. The Denkyira, for instance, was formed sometime in the 1620s. Owing to her aggressive empire expansion programs, as well as her quest to dominate commerce in the western part of the Gold Coast, Denkyira conquered neighboring towns like the Akani, Etsi, Alwyn, Seshi, Wassa, and Trifle by the 1660s. Historian Tom McKesky describes that between 1660s and the 1690s, Denkyira was the dominant power among the Twi-speaking Akan peoples of the Ofin-Pra River Basin. A significant outcome of Denkyira's successful conquest was the excessive production of slaves, of whom several were taken to port towns like Elmina and Cape Coast for sale. Additional examples can be drawn from the case of the Asante, Achim, and other kingdoms on the Gold Coast. However, the main point to note here is that the emergence of empires and states on the Gold Coast from the late 16th through the early 18th century engendered intense violence, which consequently served as a foundation for producing a countless number of enslaved people for export from the Gold Coast to other parts of the Atlantic world. In the case of Apollonia, however, violence appeared to have rather caused a decline in the slave trade and exports than an increase in them. Throughout the 18th and 19th century, Apollonia experienced some series of violence, including sporadic wars between the kingdom and its neighboring states like Wassa and Ani. Instead of helping to increase slave production and export, this series of violence caused a decline in trade within the Apollonian kingdom. John Fountain, a late 18th and an early 19th century commandant of Apollonia, Fort Apollonia, which is the European fortress in Apollonia, once lamented that because of intense violence in Apollonia and the sub-region, external trade and agricultural activities within the region had drastically declined. People feared going to their farms. Dagels Baylis, also a European merchant, also affirms Fountain's observation in 1816. Fountain's assertion cast violence as a tool that helped to decline commercial activities, the slave trade included, in Apollonia. John de Marin, a prominent 18th and early 19th century British merchant who frequented the West African coast, also affirms Fountain's reflection. On 15th October 1771, de Marin observes that gold and slaves were part of the traded items at Fort Apollonia. However, at the time of writing, the trade in both merchandises had considerably declined. And he writes, the gold trade as well as the slave trade is ruined. Indeed, the disadvantages that trade labors under now are incredible, and I am much mistaken if any ship will get interest for her money, except the prices are very high in the West Indies and little or no mortality among the slaves, be assured. The Marian's observation also presents violence as inversely correlated to slave trading and exports in Apollonia in ways that when violence surged in and around Apollonia, slave trading activities declined. Now, the above historical evidence complicates Shumway's thesis that the Gold Coast port towns became active sites for slave trading throughout the 18th and the early 19th centuries. Although a port town, Apollonia proved itself an exception to this thesis. It remained relatively insulated from high degrees of slave trading activities, and that helps to explain why only 352 enslaved peoples were exported. And at this point, I'm going to get into the European presence and settlements. Remember I said violence, European settlements, and then the existence of fortress and their uses played a role in shaping slave trade on the continent. And I'm projecting, I'm advancing two hypotheses here, that there existed a direct positive correlation between European settlements and fortresses and slave trading and exploitation on the Gold Coast. Places with high concentration of European settlement and influence experience high slave trading and export numbers. Additionally, the presence and importantly, the utility of a European fortress in a Gold Coast slave trading area was crucial in shaping the volumes of slave exports in that area. These hypotheses proved accurate in port towns like Accra, Anamabo, Cape Coast, and Elmina, where relatively strong European presence and active fortresses helped to grow and sustain the slave trade. In Apollonia, however, the presence of European fortresses and their uses did little to intensify the slave trade. So essentially what I'm saying here is this, that it is no doubt that the Atlantic slave commerce needed European traders to make it function, because the European slave traders were the #1 customers for the trade. They would purchase enslaved people and take them across the Atlantic Ocean. And so places on the Gold Coast, on the Gold Coast, the coastal towns where Europeans settled and their influence and presence were really strong, those places turned out to experience a lot of slave trading. And also places where fortresses were very active also recorded high slave exports. And I'll get into some weeds of it right now. I'm going to draw an example from Anamabo and then compare it to Apollonia, right? In Anamabo, Fanti Kabosiers, or local chiefs, and Abrempong, that is local merchant princes and important men, such as John Cranting or Cranting, collaborated with European merchants and officials like Joseph Dawson, a late 18th century English commandant of the Anamabo fort, to centralize the trade in slaves to enhance more significant exports and profit. Historian James Stewart explains that foreign slave traders who came to Anamabo benefited from this organized trade network. He writes, Rhode Islanders, and here he means people from Rhode Island here in the US, Rhode Islanders mingled with resident British agents and local Fanti traders who in turn had connections with inland slave suppliers to obtain slaves. With such trade networks and an active fortress, which is William Fort, that was in Anamabo, in place, Anamabo was well positioned to funnel a significant number of enslaved people from the Gold Coast to the larger Atlantic world. The presence of numerous European traders at Anamabo also was a guarantee that the port town would become a hotbed for the slave trade commerce. Little wonder that the English trading company on the Gold Coast in 1750 considered Anamabo as a key to the whole trade of the Gold Coast, and in 1773 classified it as the mart for trade. In contrast to Anamabo, Apollonia was an exception to the general assumption that European presence and fortresses were catalysts to the Atlantic slave trade. Although Europeans occupied Benin, the then capital of Apollonia, in the 1750s and constructed a fort, which is Fort Apollonia there in the late 1760s, Apollonia remained resilient at resisting the growth of the Atlantic slave trade within its boundaries. Two major factors help to explain Apollonia's resistance. And first, the early kings of Apollonia exercised robust agency in preventing Europeans from permanently settling within the kingdom. This action significantly stymied European activities and influence in Apollonia, especially during the first half of the 18th century. And second, among the many uses of Fort Apollonia, the only European fort in the Apollonian kingdom, the trade in African slaves was not its primary function. And these two factors contributed to the minimal concentration of the slave trading and exploitation in Apollonia. So essentially, I'm saying that, well, Europeans did exist in Apollonia, and I'll show some graphical things right in a bit. But the interventions that Apollonian rulers put in place helped to minimize their operations, and also the fortress over there, Fort Apollonia, did not seem to be actively used to trade human slaves. This sort of chart, I'm going to minimize this again. And you realize that in Apollonia, the British came in there in 1750. And then the Dutch came in there in 1867. By 1867, the slave trade had drastically declined. And then the English took over again in 1872. But let's compare this data with that of Elmina. The Portuguese arrived in Elmina arrived on the Gold Coast in 1471, and established the castle there, the Elmina Castle, in 1482. Now compare 1482 to 1750. That means that Europeans came to Apollonia very late, very, very late. And that helps to explain why we have, when you actually consider the numbers over here for Apollonia, you realize that we have 0000 up until the 1750s that Apollonia began to record numbers over here. And it's not surprising because here we are observing that the British were able to only come in during the 1750s. And I'm arguing that all of these contributed to sort of shipping the slave trade in Apollonia. Now, compared to other coastal towns on the Gold Coast, European presence in Apollonia was nominal, and their direct entry into the kingdom came very late. While places like Elmina and Axim started receiving Europeans into their territories as far back as the late 1400s and the early 1500s, Apollonia began experiencing direct European operations in the second half of the 17th century. The delayed European operations in Apollonia resulted from political interventions that 18th century Apollonian rulers such as Anoble and Amicia Pengley implemented. For instance, in the first half of the 18th century, the Dutch, who by then had established a base in Axim, made several attempts to occupy Apollonia, but King Amicia Pengley vehemently resisted a Dutch attack by battling them in war. Amicia defeated the Dutch on 3 occasions. To prevent future incursions, Amicia invited the English into Apollonia in 1750 to settle and construct Fort Apollonia in Benin. It was not until after a century later that the Dutch could formally operate in Benin. So my argument is that the weak European presence and operations in Apollonia contributed to the minimal concentration of slave trading and export in the region, right? And concerning the use of the fort, European archival sources further depict that although a European fortress existed in Apollonia, the fort did little to increase the slave trade and export in the region. Fort Apollonia was constructed by the British in 1768 at the request of the then King Amicia Pengley. The African company records on Fort Apollonia from the 1760s to the late 18th century do not mention the sale or export of slaves. Instead, the trade in gold and ivory looms large in the record. It therefore appears that the buying and selling of enslaved people at Fort Apollonia was not the fort's primary function or even the secondary. However, Fortresses in towns like Cape Coast, Elmina, and Anamabu appear to have been functional in shipping several enslaved Africans to the Americas in the 18th and early 19th century. For example, in 1789, that year, 1789, William Ford in Anamabu conveyed about 2,107 enslaved people to the Americas. This figure far exceeds Apollonia's total export in a century. Altogether, the weak European presence in Apollonia and the minimal use of Fort Apollonia for slave trading significantly diminished the intensity of the Atlantic slave trade within the Apollonian kingdom. And here I'm saying that, well, violence, European settlement, and active fortresses helped to increase the slave trade, but in Apollonia, these factors did not help to increase the slave trade. In addition to these factors, within Apollonia, there were certain conditions that the leaders of Apollonia capitalized on to sort of mitigate the slave trade. And I'm going to actually talk about briefly about these ones. I've classified them into two: political structures or political measures, and religious and sociocultural measures, right? So Apollonian leaders capitalized on certain political and sociocultural conditions in the kingdom to further mitigate the growth of the slave trade. These conditions comprise Apollonia's inability to expand its territory through warfare, and its use of and the use of Amonle practice, which is a ritual which I'll discuss very briefly. That ritual discouraged the internal production of slaves within the Apollonian kingdom for the Atlantic market. And now, concerning the political factor, right? Throughout its history, Apollonia was never successful in implementing empire expansion programs. Now, what I'm trying to argue here is that, well, other places where violence prevailed, they usually were associated with state formation processes, right? As kingdoms expanded, when Asante defeated the Dentra in 1700, 1701, they began expanding westward and taking territories and all of that. Those sort of empire expansion programs produced lots of slaves for sale. In the case of Apollonia, we do not witness anything like that. Now, the kingdom of Apollonia engaged in several wars, especially with neighboring states such as Anyi and Wassa. And in many of these instances, Apollonia emerged victorious. However, Apollonia's victories were not significantly decisive to allow for territorial expansions or the subjugation of an opponent to a vassal status. The kingdom did not possess a relatively large military force or the logistical or administrative capability to build a powerful empire like that of the Asantes or the Achims. Thus, all the wars that Apollonia fought turned out to be expressions of either self-defense, a response to a breakdown in diplomatic agreement, or a quest for political recognition. It is therefore my argument that because of the absence of territorial expansion programs in Apollonia, especially during the 18th and early 19th century, mass production of slaves and intense slave trading were kept to the bare minimum. Right. And then now moving on to the Amonle factor. Now, Amonle is an enzymal word that means an oath, a curse, or an ordeal test. J.Y. Aka, a writer or a historian of the Nzima or the Apollonian region, explains that in the pre-colonial era, Amonle functioned as a spiritual covenant established between Apollonian rulers and new migrants who settled within the kingdom. This covenant contained powerful spiritual incantations that ensured the new settlers' loyalty to the king. In return, the king promised physical protection to the newcomers. Because of the Amonle covenant, Apollonian kings refrained from selling their subjects or new settlers into slavery, as was witnessed in other places, even on the Gold Coast, for instance. And I'll share an example. So it's essentially, when in the olden days, when newcomers entered into the Apollonian region, they would make a covenant. It came in the form of a blood covenant, and people respected this covenant so much that the newcomers would maintain their loyalty to the king, support the king in times of war, and acknowledge the king as their overlord, and in return the king will offer protection and wouldn't sell the people into slavery. But elsewhere on the Gold Coast, especially the southeastern part in the Anlo region, right? In the first half of the 19th century, there is a town called Atoko, right? It was popular for its role as a slave market town in the southeastern Gold Coast. Tradition explains that in this area, a personal grudge emerged between Togbe Tamaklo, of the chief of Wuti, and Dogbe, a leader of a drumming group or a cultural troupe, as we call them in Ghana, who also came from that Wuti township. As it turned out, Dogbe had fancied Togbe Tamaklo's wife, and the offended chief had arranged to sell Dogbe and his entire team into slavery. Now, this is what Tamaklo did. The chief tricked the drumming group into performing on what was deemed to be a Portuguese or a Brazilian ship. Given so much rum while on the ship, the entertainers became intoxicated and helpless. But Dogbe, the target, managed to jump off the ship when he realized that the ship had started sailing. Dogbe swam ashore and told the story. To date, this incident is still remembered in the Wuti community, and Chief Tamaklo's family is despised for that action. But in Apollonia, we do not witness anything like that. And this is not to suggest that nothing like that happened. But as far as evidence goes, we do not have evidence that suggests that something like that happened. And that reason could be attributed to the Amonle factor. So what I'm saying here is that the absence of territorial expansion programs in Appolonia and the influence of the Amonle Covenant within the kingdom contributed to minimizing the growth of the Atlantic slave trade in Apollonia. And now I'm bringing my talk to a close. I know that I may have inundated you all with a lot of information, and I'm going to summarize everything. Like, this study has sought to complicate our understanding of the transatlantic slave trade on the Gold Coast by looking at an exceptional case where the trade did not flourish. It uses Apollonia to show how the geography of the Atlantic slave trade in the region was more diverse and complex than scholars have often acknowledged. Right. Using oral histories, statistical data, and contemporaneous letters and records, the study establishes that Apollonia remained an outlier in the Gold Coast slave trade economy throughout the 18th and early 19th century. Some contributing factors for Apollonia's outlier status include the relative lack of European presence in the kingdom, the minimal use of Fort Apollonia for slave trading, the lack of successful imperial projects in Apollonia, and the influence of social traditions like the Amonle Covenant. Now, these are my final thoughts. Right. This finding reconsiders received orthodoxies in African historiography and slave trade debates that suggest that Gold Coast port towns and even West African coastline transformed into active sites of intensive slave trading throughout the Atlantic era. As this study reviews, not all port towns actively traded enslaved people. And indeed, this study has identified several contributing factors that help to explain why Apollonia was so different. But there may be other unconsidered factors too, right? And these are the final thoughts that I would like to leave that possibility to the reader. Nonetheless, it is essential to note that to answer exactly why the slave trade did not flourish in Apollonia, or in other words, to find all the evidence to suggest that, well, slave trade did not flourish in Apollonia, is not as important as showing what we gain by asking that question. Time does not allow for such discussion here, yet the following questions lead to future inquiries. 1, why does it matter to study regions of West Africa where the slave trade was less dominant? And 2, what do outliers like Apollonia teach us about more critical historical questions about empires, cultures, and African agency in the era of the Atlantic slave trade? Perhaps we could discuss this some more in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric, for a very nice presentation.
Thank you.
If you have questions, you can raise your hands now, or you can write it in the Okay, in the Q&A. So I see that somebody has raised their hand. Let me allow them to talk. Edward, please unmute.
Okay, thank you very much. And that was a nice presentation. I enjoyed listening to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, but there are two factors that you didn't mention. Well, you alluded to them, but you didn't mention them as major factors. As you know, in South America, for instance, in Argentina and Chile, the native population was practically exterminated by the Spanish colonials. But in Bolivia and Peru, the population is still maybe 80 or 90% indigenous people. And the reason was that those people produced textiles, which the Spanish wanted. So that's why they didn't kill them. And in the case that you mentioned that the British were interested in ivory, if they sent them away for slavery or something like that, there wouldn't be anybody to cut the tusk or harvest the crops. So I think that's a major reason why they didn't enslave the people.
Okay.
Yeah, another reason might be is because of the isolation of the territory. It's defended on two sides by rivers and as you said, the ocean, and therefore, and that's your expertise, is the bodies of water, right?
Yeah.
And because of that relative isolation, but not isolation with a weak kingdom, but with a strong kingdom, is why they weren't enslaved, and also probably why they didn't expand. Because if they expanded, they would have to establish communities on the other side of the river,
Right.
on the opposite sides of the river. So anyhow, I really enjoyed your presentation. I wish you good success in getting your dissertation.
Thank you. Thank you, Edward. I think some people raised their hands or.
Yeah, that's what it was. So anybody who have question can type them or raise their hand. And for me, Eric, you mentioned the fact that people don't really remember very much what happened. And I just wanted to know your thought about this.
Yeah.
Not remembering.
Yeah, it's a great question. And the historically, memories of people have played a significant role in explaining slave trade issues of the past, right? There are a ton of works on that. And so in a way, people's memories have become a lens for looking at how slave trade played out in a region. And I'm saying that in Apollonia, people are not remembering this quite well. And it could be because of several reasons. But considering what the slave trade data set is telling us, as in the minimal slave concentration, I'm more inclined to believe that perhaps because slave trading was very minimal in the kingdom, it might not have been a predominant feature of the society. Let me do a little comparison here. When you go to Cape Coast, for instance, you would see European styled houses, like material culture there. The castle is very imposing, and when you read books, you get a mental picture that on the streets of Cape Coast, enslaved people were paraded and all of that, and people remember it quite fondly, or maybe relatively fondly, than what we observe in Apollonia. And it's because in Cape Coast, the trade was quite intense, was quite concentrated there, as opposed to Apollonia. So my argument is that, well, because perhaps because the trade wasn't quite predominant in Apollonia, that is why the people are not really exhibiting a lot of fond memories about it.
Wonderful, thank you. Kerry, unmute, please.
All right, thank you very much for that presentation. I'm just curious here. You asked the question, why did slave trade not flourish in Apollonia? I thought that you could also answer the question by looking at or trying to address the fact that why did it flourish in the other parts, like Gold Coast, and it didn't flourish on the other side?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe look at the population composition, especially the Europeans who are coming in. Did that have anything to do with it?
That's a good one. Yeah, can I attempt to address it?
Yes, certainly.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, I think I did in a way, not necessarily looking at the population. In the entire project, I discussed the population, and I'll be happy to discuss that here too. But I was saying that elsewhere on the Gold Coast, these three factors: the violence, European settlement, and the utility of fortresses played significant roles in shaping the slave trade. And I was saying that elsewhere on the Gold Coast, for instance, Cape Coast, Elmina, Anamabo, Accra, these fortresses were very active. European presence was very visible. And violence in the interior was helping to produce lots of enslaved people to these areas. And so these factors helped to produce or help to encourage the slave trade in those areas. But when you come to Apollonia, the southwestern part of current day Ghana, these factors were not really encouraging or stimulating the slave trade. And that was where I was reading contemporaneous letters and records of people who lived there as of that time. John Fountain, for instance, he states that violence in and around Apollonia has rather like declined trade, which the slave trade was part of it. And then I also was showing records of, discussing the records of the African Company, which was the official like mercantile company representing the British on the Gold Coast, that their records suggest that from 1760s, when that was the period that the Fort Apollonia was constructed, all the way to the end of the 18th century, right? The sale of slaves were not in their records. However, like gold and ivory were there. And so I'm saying that these factors they were inversely correlated to slave trade in Apollonia, but in elsewhere, they encouraged the sale of slaves.
So can we assume that there was some resistance in Apollonia to slavery, or was it just they were too concentrated on other kinds of trade that
right.
they didn't really pay attention to?
Right. That's a very solid point. And I like the point that Edward raised. Edward, I'm sorry that I didn't bring in the water part. I felt like I am going way beyond time, so I just had to cut it short. Now, the fact that Apollonia was bordered by water was a significant condition, because to cross the water required extra tact, extra scale, and all of that. And so the water served as natural defense. And in my larger project, I project water as not only a resource, but also an agent and a context for understanding how bodies of water have shaped slave trade debates and occurrences. In other words, they prevented the increase of slavery within Apollonia. Again, the Amonle Covenant that I talked about, it prevented Apollonian kings from selling off their own people. And so there were internal conditions, which I talked about, that one, Apollonia did not engage in empire expansion programs. And then the Amonle too prevented their kings from, or discouraged their kings from selling their own people into slavery. So these are some of the internal conditions that help to mitigate the Atlantic slave trade. I don't know if I'm helping.
Well, thank you. I think that's very good, and I'm going to wish you all the best.
Thank you.
For your dissertation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Jesse, unmute, please.
All right, thank you very much. And Eric, thank you very much for such a good presentation. I really enjoyed it. I mean, for you mentioning my hometown, and yeah, I really enjoy. Now I know the number of people that, yes, concerning slavery, I know the number of people that came from my hometown from the 17th to the 19th century. And my question is, now, when you consider the development of Apollonia right now to, I mean, those places of, Anumabo or the Cape Coast, I mean, in terms of development, I mean, which countries or which cities are really more developed? And if the Cape Coast or the Anomabu situation, can we say that even the slavery also brought a little development to the people? I mean, a city that there were more people who were engaged in slavery.
Okay. Thank you, Jesse. I didn't know you were from Nzima area. It's nice knowing that too. Concerning, I think you asked two questions about development, right?
Yeah.
And what else, please?
And I said, if the people in, let me say, Cape Coast or Kromante or Anomabu, if that community now is maybe well developed than Apollonia, can we say that
it's because of the slave trade?
Yeah,
Okay. That's a good question. It's a difficult one too. I think that the concept of development is quite complex, and it would depend on what you might consider development. But if you were to talk about the physical, like, or visible erection of infrastructure and all of that, clearly Cape Coast is well developed than maybe Anomabu, I guess. And when you come to Nzima, and Nzima land is really huge, right? It's very, very huge. And still, Cape Coast is still popular. But I think that, popular and maybe more advanced in terms of infrastructure. But I think that tying that to the slave trade will not be a good idea to do that kind of analysis, because after the slave trade, a lot of things happened, right? A lot of things happened, but legitimate trade, the colonialism, right? And post-colonial issues, Ghana gaining independence and all of that. But the question is, how relevant were these towns? Kwame Nkrumah is from Nkrofo and Zimaland, but it's not as developed as Cape Coast, because I would argue that while the presence of Europeans in certain areas helped continue a tradition, right? Check Accra, for instance. Accra had 3 forts, one for the British, one for the Dutch, and one for the Danes. It tells you the strong presence of Europeans there. Little wonder Accra is the capital. Cape Coast, for instance, Sekendi, Takrade, and all of that. So I think it's a combination of factors, but on the face value, these towns are, I would say, maybe more advanced in terms of infrastructure and government initiatives and all of that done in Nzima land. I'm sorry that Nzima is not showing up to predominantly here. Yes.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
I also see some questions in the chat, and I think one is from Ahin Champong. Hi, Ahin. Ahin, I'm reading your question. I think your last question, which points to African agency, is interesting, and I would like to know if you intend to explore that further. Certainly, I'd like to explore that further, and I think it's very fascinating, as you pointed out, because in debates on slave trade and even empire formation and all of that, some scholars have argued that, well, states had to trade in slaves in order to reproduce itself, in order to survive. And so Dahomey, Asante, and others, they had to capture people, sell some off to get money, retain some for them to work as whatever, so that the state will keep running. But in the case of Apollonia, it was a state, it was a centralized society, but it kind of insulated itself or removed itself from slave trade or slavery or slave trading for a bit. And that should tell you how people apply their will, the agency, their intervention. So I think it's something I'm definitely going to explore. Yeah, I see another one from Roland. I was wondering if you found some relevant data or information on how religion, more particularly Christianity, played a role in the slave trade in and around Apollonia. That's a great question. Apollonia is a very interesting place. It has been, for lack of a better term, a frontier territory, and I use frontier to mean both a borderline, a border town, and also a space where things are not really like dominant. It feels like people are not paying attention to that place quite well. So when Christianity emerged on the Gold Coast, I mean, the Basel missions, the Basel people were the people to come to the Gold Coast early, and I think they came around 1829 or 1838, or like the turn of the 1830s, I guess. And they operated far away from Apollonia. actually far, far away. So Christianity came to Apollonia quite late. And I think they might have gone to Apollonia after slavery had been abolished. And so it'll be difficult to link Christianity to slave trade. Not to say that missionaries did not sort of go there, but as far as like Christianity emerging and becoming so pronounced in the region, it came there quite late. And mind you, the British themselves even went there around 1750. The Dutch came there in 1867. So operations in Apollonia were relatively late. And I should point out that the Seventh-day Adventists emerged from Apollonia, emerged from in Zimaland. So just an FYI.
Donson,
Hi, Dawson.
You can unmute.
Wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed seeing the course that your dissertation is headed. And I had a question for you actually and it kind of relates to this issue of agency that you were discussing a little bit. And it's specific to, you propose these 3 reasons for why the trade in enslaved people didn't really pick up in Apollonia compared to other places. You talk about the absence of territorial expansion, and you talk about Amonle. But then the second one that you mentioned about the Apollonian leaders discouraging European settlement in the region to the same degree that it occurred other places. I'm curious as to why, right? Any insights into both why they discouraged that settlement? I mean, were they looking around, for example? I mean, you mentioned how the British arrived relatively late compared to other parts, mid 18th century. Were the leaders looking around and saying, seeing kind of the intensity of the trade in other places and seeing the deleterious effects? Were there other factors like in local religious practices or trade practices that kind of led them to discourage this settlement? Could you maybe speak a little bit about that if you have a little bit of time?
Yeah, Lawson, thank you. That's a great question, really. I discussed that in the project that, well, I am inclined to believe that Apollonian leaders preferred to maintain peace and sort of maintain the integrity of their borders than to expand it. The society started as a small nucleus of villages, right? But they accepted a lot of people, including Insulezo people. So Nkrofo people are believed to have come from, I think, Akwamu or so. Asante people came there, several other people. So refugees of war will come over and they will accept them, and they will use the Amonle to sort of define their relationships. So I even argue in my larger project that these leaders adopted or implemented open border policy, right? But as far as they going out, it's another question, and it's very interesting. I think that the leaders were interested in sort of safeguarding their territory while being able to trade with Europeans, because the Dutch ousted the Portuguese in Elmina, and after that came to Axim, which is about 1 hour drive from the capital of the then Apollonia, which it's really close. I mean, when you cross the river, if you're able to cross the river, you're on your way to the political seat of Apollonia. Right, and they saw how brutal the Dutch were. And by the way, on the western side, the French were there in Assini. So they were all like sandwiched by European forces. But they tried to sort of keep their sanity. They tried to maintain their territorial integrity for a long time. And I am inclined to believe that, well, their willpower, their agency, their intervention was to sort of keep their territory and not expand it that much. And I would also argue that, well, I don't think that they had all it took to sort of do a territorial expansion as the Asante did. I mean, in terms of population, historians like Reiki explain that at the turn of the 1800s or 18th century, Apollonia or Axim would have had a population of about 4,000, 5,000. And it's similar to Apollonia. So Apollonia didn't have a lot of population to sort of make those long distance trade as compared to Asante, who would carry over 200,000 armies, go all like over 200 miles to go conquer. So I think, yeah, maybe it was a self determination or sort of a concerted plan to sort of retain their territorial integrity. I'm not sure if I helped, Dawson.
Yeah, no, that was wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate it. And again,
thank you
for the
too.
presentation. Good luck.
Thanks. Hi, Edward. Oh, okay.
Okay, let me go to Damaris. Damaris, you can unmute, please.
Hello, I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, so thank you so much, Eric, for that very wonderful talk. My question is, from your talk, it doesn't seem like the capturing of slaves was unique to slave trade. Like the slaves were not captured for the purposes of being traded as slaves. It's a tradition. Say it again.
In Apollonia, you mean, or on the Gold Coast?
The Gold Coast. Maybe, did I get it right? Through the violence and capturing of slaves even within the communities in the Gold Coast, the Atlantic.
Oh, okay. Do you want me to clarify that, or you want to finish your question?
Clarify that, because the question I had was that
okay.
The motivation to export or to sell slaves across the Atlantic, was it the same to have slaves within? Is there any relevance between the slaves that were kept within the communities as part of the violence, the same as the trading them across? Like did they?
Yeah.
You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. If I clearly understand what you're saying, you mean like on the Gold Coast, were people inclined to sell slaves or enslaved people than retain them? Is that what you mean?
So retaining slaves, the essence of slavery is this, I believe, is the same. If you're keeping a slave, you're keeping them for a purpose. There's power involved in having slaves, the slave tradition. So what I'm asking, what do you think, I'm asking as from the historical perspective, do you think the motivation in terms of power relations in keeping a slave even within a family, within a society, a more powerful society, keeping slaves within, capturing slaves, that is it the same as selling them across? For example, did the trade mean that the across the Atlantic, that is, mean that it was a culture that was already established? Like if I can keep a slave within, it's the same thing as selling them. Did they know that there's a difference between keeping one within your boundaries and selling them across the Atlantic?
Yeah. That's a good question. It's very complex. I'll try to address it. I think that to be able to better address this question, we want to trace change over time, right? How was indigenous slavery before the advent of the Atlantic slave trade, right? And you realize that, well, people had different reasons for enslaving people even before the Atlantic slave trade, but popular reasons include for reproduction and production. So you want females to sort of reproduce a lot for you, and you also want labor on your markets, and so these are dominant themes as far as utility of slaves were concerned in the pre-colonial era. But with the advent of the Atlantic commerce, certain economic conditions and inclinations became attached to it. People became economically greedy, and so slaves became slaves that were meant to reproduce or meant to help with labor stuff tend to be sent away for some money. And so that also introduces another level of complexity to the whole thing. And also some leaders also displayed or sort of disposed of slaves as a way of power. I'm going to go off of Gold Coast a bit. When you go to Dahomey, there's this king called Agaja, And in history, he could slaughter 4,000 people after he's won a victory. He says, I'm slaughtering them to the glory of the gods. And he does that just for personal aggrandizement and to feel his ego or to massage his ego and for spiritual reasons too. So there are a couple of reasons. But as far as the Atlantic slave trade is concerned, taking people to the coast and having them go away, you might have a reason like you want to really dispose of this person for whatever reason, or you want cash, or you want European goods. And the example that I used from Atoko, that this guy fancied the wife of the chief and he wanted to dispose him of. Well, he would dispose him of, but also you would get some cash. So I think it varies across space and time, but also tracing change over time helps to sort of make us understand the trajectory of how these things have unfolded over time. I don't know if I've helped.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you too.
I think Edward has a follow-up question.
Okay.
Yeah, I was wondering, what was the basis of the wealth of Apollonia prior to the arrival of the Europeans? I know, for instance, that the last people who were enslaved in Bolivia, while you have a large community of Black people in Bolivia, was that they produced coca for the miners.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just wondering, you know, British are famous for indirect rule.
Mm-hmm.
What was Apollonia producing something that was useful to the British other than slaves and other than ivory?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. There was the production of salt. It was noted for producing a lot of salt and agricultural produce too, and fish. I mean, within these bodies of water, there's just that fresh, like tilapia, and all that, and so it was a very good merchandise for the marketers of then. But I think you make mention of one important thing that I would want to even bring up right now. If Apollonia is not trading slaves, what are they doing? Right? If they're not trading slaves, what are they doing?
Exactly.
And it's a very key, and that's what I used to sort of challenge, if I would say, some of the existing theses that centralized states tended to trade in slaves because they needed that to reproduce themselves. In Apollonia, they are not actively trading in slaves. What are they doing? They are engaging in this production of gold, and in fact, there was a gold mine in Apollonia, especially its northern side, getting into Awing and Wassa. And actually, the northern part of Apollonia is where Ghana's gold mines are. Besides Obuasi, are pretty situated. We have the Takwa and Bogo, so they are all at the northern side of Apollonia, and they all get entwined into the northern fringes of the river. So these economies over there are pretty small, but also quite diverse and intricated into European interactions and the Atlantic market. And so Europeans are trading. They come there to trade, but they do not live there. They don't establish a base over there. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you too.
Eric, there are some questions in the Q&A. So
yeah,
has a question.
Okay, I'm going to read it out. It's from, I see FF. So hi FF. Hi Eric. Thank you for an interesting presentation. My question is on the issue of memory and slavery in Apollonia. Don't you think that the silences or the unenthusiasm expressed by your interlocutors on the subject is a way or strategy to distract themselves from conversations around the subject of slavery because of the discomfort and negative memories associated with the subject? You know, until the early 2000s, this whole discussion on the question of slavery only took place among scholars because it was largely seen as a taboo subject among local communities who experienced this event in history. That is completely accurate. I think I acknowledge that. I said that, well, the fact that the people are not talking could be that they have intentionally suppressed those memories for whatever reasons. But I was more inclined to agree with the other side, which is perhaps slavery wasn't so predominant in the region. That's why they're not talking, because of the the lessons that the other sources told me or sort of exhibited, i.e. the statistical data is saying that, well, slave exports were really minimal, and that suggests that slave trade was quite minimal. Well, European presence is very minimal here, or quite almost invisible, and that should suggest that, well, slave trade might not have been quite active here because we don't have buyers from here, right? And so definitely, I completely agree with you that people may not be talking about it because of the horrors of those memories or the past events, and it's a valid point. But I was more inclined to go that route because of what the other sources told me. Thank you. I see that Dennis has his hand up.
Yes, for me, it's not a question. It's more of giving a thank you and a comment. What you're doing is very good, and I really encourage this, because I can say for me, my generation, we were not taught about the African history. We never knew about Mansi Musa. I came to know about Mansi Musa when I was old. In school, they told us about Julius Caesar. They told us about, the Renaissance, but we never knew that this was going on in Africa. And this is something that we missed. And people like you, when you bring out such stuff, we want to show this to our children that, Africa, we had a culture, we had a history, we had kingdoms. Very few Africans know about the Kingdom of Benin. Very few, but they know about Julius Caesar. That's something we were denied. And I really encourage such kind of talks. And man, thank you very, very, very much to enlighten us on this thing, especially me coming from the eastern part of Africa. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Dennis. I appreciate it.
Question, do you know whether slaves were brought in from further north in Ghana, Burkina?
Can you say it again?
So Jay Olson asked, do you know whether slaves were brought in from further north in Ghana?
Okay. Yeah. Let me share my screen again and see if I can help with that. There. Good. Okay, here. Can you all see? I mean, Professor Sarr, can you see the screen? Is it projected?
Yeah, it is.
Right. So what my discussion has been around this side here, right? But these sort of fortresses were here, and the Asante were here. So Asante became a dominant power from the 1700s onwards, right? And they were essentially responsible for a lot of enslaved people coming from the north here. So they conquered territories over here. And there are instances where they would go for tributes, and people like Ward, for instance, and Ivor Wells, and they all discuss how Asantes could go for 1,000 tribute of enslaved people, and they bring them here, they bring them to Elmina. They established a very good rapport with Elmina, because when it defeated Dentra, the Dentra was somewhere here. They defeated Dentra, they started conquering territories over here. So they dominated over here. But for Cape Coast, the Fantis wouldn't allow Asante to penetrate, because the Fanti wanted to be middlemen who wanted to trade directly. Like, they wanted to be in between Asante traders who would come from the north, and then they would see the Fanti people would take them to the British. Fanti also wanted, the Asante also wanted to trade directly with the British. So Asante tried to avoid the Cape Coast as best as they could. And then they had their targets going to Elmina most often, and maybe some other side there after their defeat of Achem, I guess. Now, I can speak to Elmina, for instance. When they received tributes from the Dagomba and other ethnic groups over here, they will bring them here. And the Dutch were in Elmina by then, and they had a good rapport with the Dutch. Actually, there is a huge conversation about what they call the Dutch notes, or there's this document, unspoken document. It was a rapport, an agreement that they had with Asante. So there was a route here that that was really respected and was very active, that people were coming in. The Asantes also came all the way to like Bonduku, Jama, and Techiman and all these places. And they actually extended all the way to they met Traore, this Senegalese empire guy who also was coming eastward, and then those sort of kingdoms sort of clashed, and that was where Asante's empire got as far as to in terms of the West. So essentially, they were getting enslaved people from here, and when they conquer you, they wouldn't live there. They would station an officer over there most of the times, and then you would be sending in your tribute sometimes in the form of slaves, and sometimes when they conquer people, they bring them to the coast. But I could confidently speak about the Elmina route. I don't know if I'm helping.
Thank you very much, Eric. We are out of time, but there is one more question. If you can just answer it.
I'm all for questions.
Okay. Slavery or enslavement as practiced by Western countries dehumanized Africans and did not even consider those enslaved as humans. Slavery as practiced by Africans themselves did not dismiss their humanity. Is that a correct assumption, or do you have data to negate this assumption? That's from Solomon.
Can you say it one more time? I think I lost you in the middle.
So Solomon asks slavery or enslavement as practiced by Western countries dehumanized Africans, and did not even consider those enslaved as humans. Slavery as practiced by Africans themselves did not dismiss their humanity. Is that a correct assumption, or do you have data to negate this assumption? That's the question.
Okay, that's a good one. I would say to a far extent, yes. The chattel form of slavery was very dehumanizing as compared to the indigenous forms of slavery in West Africa, I would say, or Gold Coast. But it also ranged from place to place. I cannot get into like details about some of these things, but I cannot also confidently say that those who were enslaved on the African soil had it quite okay. I mean, if any of those enslaved people were to live right now and you were to ask the person that, hey, how was your experience being a slave of Mr. K or Mr. A, I'm sure the person would go like, I feel dehumanized. But on a larger scale or in comparative terms, the chattel form, which we witnessed in outside of Africa, was very dehumanizing. I mean, in the New World, North America, was very dehumanizing. But indigenous slaves, especially before the advent of the Atlantic slave trade, people got integrated into the society, into families. Actually, they can't have a proverb that goes like "Obi nchere obi ase." It means you do not trace anyone's lineage, or do not go back into tracing anyone's lineage. It emerged at the time that the Asante Empire was expanding and they needed labor to cultivate a forested region. So people came in, but because of social classification and social class and all of that, people were easily identified as, you are a slave, you are an outsider. So people tended to leave, or sort of cause a disintegration. And so this unspoken conventional rule came as a form of a proverb that do not trace anyone's lineage. In other words, let's get them integrated into the society and then we can all move on. And so it's not uncommon that you'd find that Akwa, a servant who is supposed to be a foreigner, is part of the king of Asante's royal household. In fact, the seat at Bantama, and those who know Ghana quite well, or Kumasi, the seat of Bantama was a seat of a slave. Amankwetia, he was a soldier, he was a slave, but he was a soldier. He did so well that the king of Asante by then was said to bestowed on him a stew and made him chief. And today, that stew is the army commander of the Asante Empire's army from Kumasi. Right. So, yeah, there are instances where slaves or enslaved people were integrated into the society, but I think it's still relative if you were to ask them. However, compared to the chattel form, the chattel is way dehumanizing. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. We really appreciate you coming and sharing your research with us, Eric. Thank you to the audience for coming and asking questions. We'll see you next Thursday. Bye.
Sure. Thank you to everyone.